Oli Fletcher, who's a farmer in Leicestershire. We're going to talk to Julian Jessop, who's an economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, in a second. This is because Daniel Zeichner, who is the farming minister, he has said that all farming subsidies could stop. This could be as soon as 2027, 2 years from now. The money did come from the EU, although of course we paid a lot into the EU previously. Now we know that the farming minister says it could happen in 2 years' time. The inheritance tax row, of course, is a big one farmers are grappling with as well and continue to do so. Oli, thank you for joining us from Leicestershire. Oli has a farm. Tell us a bit about your farm, Oli. How many animals are on there and how many acres do you have?
Well, we have 120 acres. We're formerly dairy. We gave up, unfortunately, after Brexit. We used to milk about 100 cows or so, and we're arable now. And I've invested in some sheep to manage the grassland.
And what would losing your subsidy mean for you?
Well, us personally have been affected by this, actually, because of a bureaucratic error on DEFRA's end, whereby some of our land was rejected because they'd got the maths wrong on the amount of land in a tract. So we have lost out on this. But it's not really about us as businesses. It's about the welfare of the nation as a whole, as you were just discussing with Mark Spencer. After the war, we got these subsidies not for farmers, but for the whole population to provide cheap food for the people. And they were given to us by the Labour Party, and they are now being removed just as our food security is being called into question by, the very real possibility of the European food that we rely on. We get about 30% of our food from Europe being dragged into a conflict. So I would encourage all of your listeners to think very carefully about where their food comes from, the standard of food that they consume, and also the environment. If these are things that people care about, they need to get in touch with their MPs because it's under threat.
Julian Jessop is an economics fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Julian, what do you make of what you've heard here?
Yeah. Well, I think when you're talking about spending taxpayers' money on something, you need to have a clear reason why. And frankly, I don't actually think growing food is a good enough reason, because there is a market for food already. If people want to buy British food, they can. There isn't any obvious market failure there. Where I'm more sympathetic, though, is the idea of these sort of wider economic benefits. So, for example, what economists call externalities in the environment. So if we have, lots of attractive farms, then that's good for the local community in all sorts of different ways. So there might be a case for subsidising farmers who contribute to the environment or perhaps manage natural habitats better. So, for example, farmers who provide hedgerows that are important for wildlife, those sorts of things. But the simple activity of providing food, I think, is something that can be left to the market with no need for the taxpayer to chip in.
The market will sort this out, Oli?
No, I don't agree. I'm not an economist, I'm a historian, but I would argue that there is an almost intrinsic market failure, certainly within sectors like dairy, because you have an enormous purchasing power of the processing and retail companies, and then lots of small people, like in my own family, who produce a homogenous good. So we don't get to set the price, which means that any efficiency we possibly have gets squeezed out of us by the supermarkets, and any subsidy we receive often gets squeezed out of us as well, which means we become very, very efficient, but are not very profitable because the money is being made higher up the food chain where people have more power. And that is why we need the government to intervene in this sector to protect us from the purchasing power of these big corporations that would just destroy us if allowed to do so. And I fear that's where the Labour Party are heading with this.
Julian?
Well, the flip side of that, of course, is that people in the shops pay lower prices than they would otherwise have done. As far as the farming industry as a whole is concerned, it may well be that there are lots of smaller farms that, frankly, are not profitable if the market is allowed to operate normally. And I have to sort of ask the question, so what? I know it's a terribly difficult thing to say, and I'd be reluctant to say it necessarily face-to-face to a farmer in a pub. But at the end of the day, if the business is uneconomic, then maybe people should think of doing something else. Now, it may well be, of course, that they've got limited opportunities because, for example, planning restrictions prevent them from using the land for other things. But I think that's a problem in the planning system. If at the end of the day, a small farm is not profitable because the market is not willing to pay the going rate for the goods that they're going to produce, then I think somebody has to do something else instead.
Oli, what do you make of that? You've got a skeptical expression on your face.
It's the crucial difference here is between profitability and efficiency. I completely concede that most farms are not profitable, but that doesn't mean they're not efficient, and that doesn't mean that what they provide isn't very valuable to the nation. I would argue exceeding its market value, and therefore, has positive externalities in facilitating health within the working population. So, I do take the point that farmers are not profitable, but I think the Labour Party are thinking along the lines that you are, and are taking a lack of profitability to mean inefficiency, and they're trying to cut the fat off the bone of the countryside, but there is no fat there, and it will fall apart.
Julian, is it weird for you to be on the same side as Daniel Zeichner, the farming minister?
Well, no, I never take political positions, and if the government says something sensible, then I will support them, whether they are necessarily a party I would vote for or not.
Sure.
I will say though that I do have some concerns. I think there's a lack of detail here about exactly what the government is planning, and in particular, it feels very rushed. It feels like they're casting around for a few billion here or there. Ahead of the spending review, because the broader economic strategy is failing. So last year's October budget has clearly backfired. It's weakened the economy. It's actually undermined the public finances. So I am worried that the government is looking at pots of money it might find from somewhere, and it could just be picking on farmers. So I would still like to see a lot more detail about which subsidies they're looking at and planning to cut, and exactly what the rationale is for getting rid of them.
Thank you both very much.